Wednesday, September 21st, 2022, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Paul from the Sirius Report. We haven't spoken for a while. I think the last time was May, and a lot, of course, has been happening in the world. First of all, Paul, thank you for coming on again. How are you?
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure as ever. Yes, I'm fine. As you know, we've relocated from the UK, so that's why we probably didn't do something in August and July because we were rather busy. So, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you. And I was telling you before the interview that I was going to probably publish this in a couple of weeks, but things are changing so quickly in the world that this is going to be published almost immediately after we speak. And with that in mind, I just wanted to ask you first to look at the bigger picture. Tell the audience, the viewers, what you think is going on in the world economically, financially, monetarily, and geopolitically.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a continuation where the scales have shifted so much from when I first publicly spoke about multipolarity, which was 2015, and the fading unipolar world. And at that point, multipolarity was pretty insignificant in relative terms, but in the last 7 years, it's grown more and more, and it's become, certainly from the West perspective and the United States perspective, a serious threat, hence the ongoing Ukraine war and the desire to try and drag China into a war with Taiwan. This is just symptomatic of how, I wouldn't call it a balance of power shifting, but this big shift from a dying unipolar world to a rapidly rising multipolar world. And so, in a broad sense, without trying to be too broad about it, but the world's kind of in two camps between the global south, which is very much in the China-Russia camp. No, none of them have put any sanctions in place on Russia. They are very keen to trade and cooperate with Russia and China and to cooperate with each other and not just build China's vision of the Belt and Road, but there's all the other organizations. There's the ASEAN nations. There's, of course, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, etc., etc. And we're seeing rapid developments, and their perspective is we want to cooperate with each other. We may not fundamentally agree on certain things, but who cares? We're not here to discuss whether your human rights records are perfect or not perfect, and we may not agree with some of your political views, or we might not agree with the fact that you have strong ties with nations in the West or some of them, but we don't care. It's not important anymore. And on that basis, you can then help each other in bilateral, multilateral formats, and that can be through trade. It also can be financially, where the world's starting to increasingly de-dollarize and realizing, and this is a small, very small point, but maybe we can break it down a little bit more, where at the moment, there's nations now finally realizing that not being part of the dollar-centric world, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., is extremely advantageous. So there is this idea that, we can have an alternative financial system, and that's growing. We can have an alternative way of working economically, geopolitically. And then the West is desperately trying to hang on to what it's got, which we all understand perfectly well that economically, financially, the West is in terminal decline. Societally, we face a very uncertain future, particularly in the winter, given we're in the Northern Hemisphere predominantly, because obviously I include nations like Australia in that alliance. And we have a very uncertain future with regards to energy supplies, the cost of living crisis, inflation. And that's where we're at. So in essence, there's this kind of, there is some cross sort of pollination between the two, because there are Western nations who are kind of also in the Global South Pact, which is, of course, nations like Hungary. As I tweeted just before, Hungary was quite an active participant on the sidelines of the recent SCO summit. There's just one example. We've seen how Hungary isn't very keen on having sanctions on Russia, wants cooperation with Russia in terms of their nuclear power sector, also in terms of Russian energy. And increasingly there's more and more privately and quietly dissenting voices about the progress of the Ukraine war, because at least some heads in the West are realizing that this is economic financial suicide, and there comes a point when we have to perhaps think differently about how we plot the West's course through however long this war lasts for. So that, in a very broad sense, is where we're at, and we're seeing enormous, what I would call positive, constructive developments in the global South, the multipolar world. Sadly, in the West, we're not seeing any. It's all destructive policy making. It's all trying to contain China and Russia, trying to provoke the China-Taiwan question, the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war, but also other hot, flashpoints. They're trying to stir up tensions in Eastern Mediterranean. There's always sort of flashpoints. Kosovo is another example. There's the Azerbaijan-Armenia question as well, which has reared its head again with these cross-border, I won't so much call it a war, although sadly there's been casualties on both sides. So that's where we're kind of at, but this is very symptomatic of an empire that's dying, and dying very rapidly. And it's not a situation where, I think a lot of people think, oh, the Western Empire's got decades left. They don't necessarily understand or grasp that the West's been in decline. People have sort of asked me, I don't understand where you're coming from, but I see the beginning of the decline of the United States being the Great Depression. We're talking nearly 100 years ago, because you just look at what's happened subsequently. And for me, empires sometimes barely come into existence and start declining. But the US has been in decline for decades. And therefore, it's not sort of got decades before it completely fades into obscurity compared to what it is. It doesn't mean the US disappears. It just means the United States as an hegemonic power will cease to exist anymore, simply on the basis that more and more of the world is turning its back on the US. And the biggest failure in terms of US foreign policy, I think, in decades was, ironically, to sanction Russia's central bank and cut the banks off from SWIFT, because the rest of the world went, okay, so if we have any flashpoints of the United States doesn't like our behavior for some reason, that could be us next. And we don't have the resource base like Russia does to survive that. We would implode almost immediately. And of course, we could have huge societal unrest. And we're not prepared to take those risks. So we're increasingly saying, okay, what's the alternative? The alternative is to de-dollarize, and embrace the multipolar world. And we've seen increasingly why the Middle East is a great example, where they're just turning their back on the West, turning their back principally on the United States, and embracing multipolarity, embracing China and Russia, although this has been going on for a number of years. And then we're seeing increasingly encouraging signs of significant rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. There's a great example of something that people wouldn't have believed was possible even a few years ago, but here we are. And that's kind of emphasizing this big seismic change that's happening. And it's just this, it's here, it's baked in the cake. It's not, going to disappear. It's just the momentum's behind it. And it's not like it's trying to replace the West. There isn't desire to become hegemonic power. There isn't a desire for China to have a world reserve currency, because you don't need one. Everyone knows in the future there's no need for that anymore. It's pointless. It doesn't serve any purpose. And there are plenty of other ways of constructing financial systems that doesn't mean nations any longer have to be dependent on selling goods or buying goods in a world reserve currency.
You mentioned the IMF and like the World Bank. Do you think the global South, with the leadership of Russia and China, do you think they're going to abandon completely the IMF and World Bank, which I guess are part of they're institutions that were created out of the United Nations?
Well, it's one of two outcomes. Either these institutions evolve or they'll die. I've always said it's not really a question of saying you can't exist anymore. I mean, okay, there are complementary institutions that can technically replace them, but it's not really a question of replace them. It's a question of them effectively making themselves redundant. Because we know historically that nation after nation gets into huge financial trouble for now. It could be through mismanagement, incompetence. It could also be because there's an intention for the United States and its allies to crush a nation deliberately. This is not a secret. And therefore, what happens is nations turn to the likes of the IMF. They put them into this punishing regime of austerity that just further cripples the country. And then we have obviously seen for many decades nations effectively asset stripped and all the things that have gone on. Now, it doesn't mean at the moment the IMF's redundant. There are nations still turning around to the IMF going, well, we need a loan, but like Sri Lanka, although Sri Lanka has also turned around to the Chinese and asked them for assistance. But the way forward is for particularly for the global south or the emerging market nations is to not go to the West, try and get into a process of de-dollarizing. Don't use the dollar for international trade because their currencies are getting wrecked against the dollar. So, this is causing them an enormous amount of pain by having to trade in the dollar. So, okay, it's not necessarily always a straightforward process that they can just stop using the dollar. But, a great example is India. India's currency's got hammered against the dollar. But when you compare it against the yuan, it's pretty stable. So if they start trading in the yuan where it's possible, that's hugely beneficial to them in terms of the exports and imports for that matter. So the argument therefore is if nations increasingly realize that by ditching the dollar and going, well, okay, if we default on our dollar denominated debt, so what? We'll just default. Because what are we going to do? The credit agencies can give us a zero credit rating in the West, but we're not going to be party to them. We're not part of that financial system anymore. We don't need them. We have a big enough global south, which is 85, 90% of the world's population. It's where the vertical growth sectors are economically. So we can trade with those. We can build relations. We don't need to actually have to be party to the Western financial system at the mercy of the IMF, the World Bank, or whoever else. And we can find markets where it's viable to trade in local currencies. So even if our currency is getting hammered and wrecked against the dollar, then we're in a position where we can say, well, it doesn't matter anymore because we'll trade in local currencies with our near neighbors and increasingly, not extensively, but it's a growing sort of picture where nations are going, we don't need to trade in dollars. We can trade in local currencies. And in fact, it's enormously beneficial for us not to be part of the dollar-centric world. So there was something you mentioned before we came on, but it's an interesting point that, okay, there's a bit of a question mark for me about this so-called perceived strength of the dollar. But the point is, even if these currencies are getting wrecked against the dollar, the strength, however that has manifested itself, is actually causing de-dollarization because they're going, well, it's better for us to not buy and sell goods in dollars anymore, but to do it in local currencies. Maybe we use the yuan. I mean, one example is Bangladesh is now using the yuan in trade, and it's hugely beneficial to them. And okay, yeah, China wants the yuan to be internationalized. It doesn't want world reserve currency status. It would just like the currency to be internationalized. It's a small example, but it's one of many examples. It's just one tiny brick in a house, effectively, that's been built, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yes, and before we came on, we were talking about this, of course, that the strong dollar is pushing people away from the dollar, and that the dollar is really strong. And even though we believe, like that the dollar eventually will go the way of a lot of the Western fiat currencies, like the pound, the euro, and the yen. Even though the yen is in Asia, it's kind of part of the West. How do you see the dollar? What do you see? How do you think the dollar will devalue? Because it can't really devalue against other fiat currencies, because then the other fiat currencies will try to devalue, and it's like a losing proposition. Do you still see hyperinflation, so to speak, or heavy inflation where the dollar is just repriced versus gold, silver, and other commodities?
Yeah, okay. Let's kind of sort of work through this. Okay, I think we also have to factor into our thinking that the dollar is massively manipulated. I mean, there's all this talk of currency manipulation, and the US screams and complains about nations doing it against the dollar. But the dollar is the most manipulated currency in the world because effectively it's the engine of US hegemony. It's how it is managed to have this hegemonic power status because it can threaten and weaponize the dollar as it has done. Okay, whatever people's perspectives are, they weaponized it against the Russians with respect to the Ukraine war in a very significant way. So that's an extreme example, but they've weaponized it in other ways. And there comes a point where, as I've said, the world can increasingly de-dollarize, meaning it's just small bite-sized chunks. But China, Russia is quite significant in trading in ruble and yuan. But then you've got Russia and India trading in rubles and the rupee, and the list goes on and on. China's got it's about 70 odd nations now with currency swaps, and it's growing almost on a weekly, monthly basis. So there is more and more scope for nations to be trading in non-dollar terms. So in essence, and a part of this is because of the US weaponizing the dollar. Also, the other part, as we said, is the dollar's becoming too strong. I mean, a great example of this, not that Japan's ever going to do this, but part of Japan's problem with this ever weakening yen is because they have to import all their energy, they're getting hammered. This is causing enormous economic financial problems. They're not that they're going to, but if they turn around to the Russians and said, we'd like to buy your energy in yen, can we agree on a price? Or maybe we'll even buy it in rubles. It would solve a lot of their problems with respect to energy import costs. That's just a small example. So as economies, financial systems get more and more unstable, you're going to see more and more nations by default moving away from the dollar. So as the dollar gets weaker in international trade terms, it doesn't really matter whether the dollar is perceived to be getting stronger against the yen and the euro. It becomes a bit of an irrelevance from my perspective. But you make the point. What's the pinch point for the dollar? Well, yeah, the dollar isn't going to suddenly collapse against the euro or the pound or the yen. It's just not reality. But there are a couple of scenarios, and we shouldn't dismiss these as not being possible because they're perfectly feasible. The Chinese could come out tomorrow, next week, and say, we're back in the yuan with gold. Now, that will cause an immediate, well, for me, the dollar's toast. I mean, what it would do in terms of the dollar priced against, as you say, gold or silver, you would see this massive spike in price, which to reflect the reality of the dollar. The dollar at some point is going to be toasting in respect of gold and silver. Now, what that price is, I don't really particularly care, or I'm not bothered because I don't care what it is in fiat terms. What's important is, for me, with gold, to use as an example, is what's its purchasing power in the future. And we've talked about this before. That's the important factor, not how it's priced in fiat terms, because gold could be $500,000 an ounce, but you wouldn't sell it. The gold could be $1,000 an ounce in the future, and you'd sell it because you can then buy assets that means its purchasing power is extremely strong. So we have to be careful we don't get bogged down in what the price means, but in relative terms, whatever that scenario is in the future, yeah, the dollar is going to become worthless in relative terms against precious metals. But as I said, if the Chinese announced the yuan to be gold backed, then the dollar is going to crater against the yuan. This, for me, is a pretty obvious statement. Does that mean it's going to happen? At this point, we don't know. But what I do know is in 2016, they were planning on doing it. The Chinese and the Americans said that's a declaration of war, and they went, okay, we're not doing it. They're now not concerned about doing it because they know the declaration of war threat is not going to be a reality, because the world's dramatically changed, not least because of Russia's heavy weapon intercontinental ballistic missile superiority, which is vastly greater than what the West has in its nuclear arsenal. People don't like this, but it's just a statement of fact. So there are those scenarios where, in that case, that could change the picture dramatically. Or another alternative could be that the Chinese comes out and says, well, we're repricing gold to something against the yuan, and causes a massive arbitrage initially. So all the gold obviously goes east, even though that's been significantly the case in the last 6 months, 12 months or so. And that would then cause and automatically end up causing a repricing and blow up the paper markets in the West. And the other scenarios, of course, we know gold and silver in dollar terms is suppressed heavily because, again, they don't want to see gold, say, at $2,500 an ounce, because you would see the biggest stampede out of paper into gold, even if the gold's available or not available. So they're desperate to suppress the price in paper terms. But if the paper markets, as I've always said, when the West is drained of gold, then paper markets will crater, and then we may see true price discovery, in which case maybe gold goes to $2,500 an ounce quickly, for argument's sake. I'm not saying that is the case, but if that happened, you'd see this big stampede out of paper dollars into gold, or the attempt to do so. And that's another scenario where confidence in the dollar becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, and there are many reasons why that may happen. Then we would see this big acceleration in relative terms in the price of gold. And again, there's no point throwing figures in. We could say anything we like, but I'm using $2,500 as a crude figure of merit because I know what's around that price you would see enormous institutional interest. We kind of, when it got over 2,000 very briefly during the pandemic, there was suddenly a lot more interest institutionally because there was a fear that the dollar isn't the safe haven some people in the West still perceive it to be, despite the fact the currency is being debased into oblivion, it's being printed into oblivion. That doesn't seem to factor in their thinking, and they're more governed in their thought process by what gold might be. So there are all these factors why eventually, one way or the other, and in some capacity, the dollar will be priced significantly higher in gold terms. And that's just a statement of fact. Now, when that happens, we don't know, but I don't think this idea that some people have that we're a decade away from this happening is the case. We're on the cusp of major problems in the Western financial system all the time now, which doesn't mean it happens today or tomorrow. It could do, but that's the kind of window we're in now in terms of what's going on.
Good. Just wanted to move more towards Europe and maybe look at the UK and the Eurozone or European Union economic and fiscal situation. We have a new government here in the UK, and they're coming out with a mini budget on Friday in a couple of days. And today we had a government data of the budget deficit. It was double. The deficit was double of what the Office of Budget Responsibility had predicted earlier in the year, and yet the new government wants to cut taxes, which normally isn't a bad thing. But the only problem is that they're gonna spend probably over 100 billion to keep utility prices pegged. And in Europe, we're seeing the same thing. We saw German PPI at 45%. We're seeing 65 billion euros that the German government is going to fiscally pump into the economy as well. So maybe if you could touch upon that, and also the fact that, for example, here in the UK now, gilt yields, which is the equivalent of US Treasury yields, they're starting to move quite quickly. And in the past few years, whenever the pound dropped as much as it's dropping now, the market had confidence in the gilt market, and gilt yields actually went down. So I find that a bit disconcerting and worrying for the UK and for Europe as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, yeah, you make the point that in the month of August, the government borrowed 11.8 billion pounds, which was almost double, as you say, what they predicted in March. By the Office for Budget Responsibility, they always underestimate when there's a crisis going on what the borrowing is going to be. And I make the point: who do they borrow it from? Is it the printing press? And you're absolutely right. Okay, we've got a new government, effectively, the Truss, and they're falling into all the wrong traps again. I mean, we'll deal first with this idea that 2008 was the culmination of when we knew the complete abject failure of the financialization of the West and this so-called trickle-down economics, where there's all this wealth produced in the financial sector, and it trickles all the way through the economy and creates all these jobs, and we have a great thriving economy. And of course, it never happened. And 14 years later, Truss and our government, they're pushing this angle again. They want lots of deregulation in the financial system. I mean, you couldn't make this up. And because they somehow think that now we're not part of the European Union, we can reach out and create our own rules and be a major financial center, and we're all going to get rich out of it, which, of course, is nonsense. And you rightly make the point that they're talking about capping energy bills, and this is fear. They are very fearful in Western governments because they now are starting to realize that the cost of living crisis and inflation is completely out of control, and they have no control over it. So they're very fearful of people having major energy insecurity, food insecurity, potentially losing their homes, potentially losing their jobs, and creating enormous societal unrest because they can't cope with that. They can't cope with 20, 30 million people suffering this serious economic financial problems. And therefore they went, oh, let's just cap energy. So it's going to cost, the conservative estimate is about 180 billion. It's probably 250 because they always completely underestimate. So they're just going to end up printing money, and who knows, when businesses start going bust, they'll nationalize them. I mean, look at Germany and Uniper, the big energy company, they've nationalized it. They've got no choice. So it's just the endless bailouts. What are they going to do if millions of people lose their jobs? Are they going to throw them on the scrappy, or are they just going to bail them out? Kind of 2020 kind of pandemic, let's bail everyone and everything out to prevent a collapse. And unsurprisingly, the pound's extremely weak. I think it's a decade low. The last I looked, it was lower than 114. Who knows where it goes against the dollar? But yes, you're right, Mario, that typically you would expect to see confidence in gilts, but there's no confidence in any gilt markets. Look at the US yield curve. I mean, the 1 year was over 4%. The inversion's enormous. There's just this ginormous amount of treasury or bond dumping in the world, and who knows what losses people are dumping, particularly at the short end. I mean, we're starting to see central banks having to declare enormous losses. I think Swiss central bank was about equivalent of $90 billion. Okay, the argument is they can't go bust, but I'm trying to highlight a point here that bondholders are exiting and must be incurring enormous losses in the process. So there's all this enormous instability, and we're back to this point where they have to bail everything out. Bailing everything out is just going to involve enormous amounts of money printing, and all this money is going to end up in the real economy again. And it's a kind of almost not exactly, but a sort of mirror image in a sense, of Weimar Germany, whose attitude to everything was just print money. We've got a problem, print some money and sort the problem out. And that's what they're having to do. And they've got no choice, because the alternative is complete collapse, in the sense that, and even though that's still economically, financially, certainly on the cards, and we're going to increasingly see big corporations, particularly in the industrial sector, having to mothball operations or cease operations and effectively file for bankruptcy or into administration, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. And these are serious, genuine problems. And we know rising interest rates is going to have an effect on heavily indebted economies in the West, not just mortgages, because there's going to be people this year who have to remortgage their houses, in the sense that, they had a 2-3 year deal, it's expired. Now all of a sudden they're going to be in serious trouble potentially. We're already seeing people buying houses this year in negative equity. And so there's all this kind of factors that are now coming into play, and the United Kingdom's one example of this. And instead of actually acknowledging the real problems and actually having a constructive plan that involves something that will take years, we have to survive politically today. So we don't care about what policy decisions we make tomorrow, but to go through the idea that we're going to go back to financialization of the economy, relax regulations, when it spectacularly failed in 2008 and did nothing for the real economy, it is just because they have no idea. And I know people think it's deliberate. It's not deliberate. They just are simply incapable of understanding the gravity of problems and what they actually need to do, because our political system's geared around today. It's not about long-term plans. It's not about putting something in place that may take 2 or 3 terms of parliament to come to fruition, because the next government, whoever it might be, in inverted commas, just will throw all these plans out anyway. So what's the point? We're just political animals who are desperate to survive. So what we're going to do is we'll start a policy with respect to the Ukraine war, and we're not backing away from it, because we can't back away from it, because it's political suicide. So we just keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And we're just going to keep saying we don't want Russian energy, even though we need Russian energy. And we're basically screaming to the rest of the world, give us energy, and privately trying to secure deals, even if it's buying Russian energy via China that's traveled the equivalent of nearly the circumference of the planet to get there. There's all these things going on because politically they can't hold their hands up and say this was a flawed policy decision from an economic financial standpoint. So they just have to keep digging deeper and causing more and more problems for us economically, financially. And their answer to those problems is, like they did during the pandemic, we just have to bail everyone out, because, come back to the point, their biggest fear, and it was the same during the pandemic, is if we have massive societal unrest, we risk implosion, we risk the collapse of governments, the collapse of civilization from their perspective. We can't allow that to happen. So what's the alternative? Just bail everything out. Just give the energy companies whatever they need. Just cap everything. Just pump whatever money's needed. I mean, how many companies in the West are going to be nationalized in the next 3 to 6 months? But who knows? But it's probably going to be enormous. And they don't have an alternative. And unfortunately, the consequence is that most people in Western societies will not perceive that to be a problem. Yeah, they realize things are getting more expensive, for sure. And there's a lot of people now complaining, but there's some of those who go, well, we're doing this because we're going to eventually bring Russia to its knees. Well, that's not going to bring Russia to its knees. It's just that's being sold, that's spun a narrative so they don't get angry about the fact that it's the West that's caused all these problems. I mean, you can sit there trying blaming Putin for the fact they wanted to sanction Russian energy. It's farcical, but again, it's politics. And this is unfortunately something that's very symptomatic in the West, that no one's prepared to hold a hand up and admit there was a mistake, because they can't do it. But in the process, they're just grinding the West into dust. And And this is partly why the West also thinks Russia's failing, because the war's dragging on. Russia is quite happy for the war to last as long as it needs to take, more than anything, to just let the West grind itself into dust. They're quite happy to do this. And because they're seeing, well, the longer the war drags on, the more they introduce these policies that's causing more and more problems in terms of inflation, in terms of the risk of energy insecurity, food insecurity, what that could perceivably cause in terms of societal breakdown. So they're happy for the war to drag on. Their objectives are not what the West thinks they are. And it's this complete failure to understand what Russia's actually doing and why they're doing it. And the West is effectively handing itself a gun and shooting itself in the head on a kind of near repeat basis. And when you extrapolate this to Europe, it's exactly the same scenario, exactly the same problem. They have created an energy crisis for themselves. It's now affecting the real economy. We're seeing inflation spiking out of control. I mean, just look at the Netherlands. Inflation in August was 13.7% officially. That rose out nearly 2.5% month on month. And we're seeing it if we food shopping here. Inflation is rampant. I mean, some of the food stuff is so ridiculously expensive. Not all aspects of food, but quite a lot of it. And yes, it's certainly starting to affect people. And this is also the problem in Europe, that they're now starting, I think in the Netherlands, they're talking about capping energy in November, because they're all starting to panic, but they don't realize you can't print energy, you can't print food. They're trying to find financial ways to control a problem which is about the real world. It's about energy, it's about food, it's about real commodities. It's the things that are the engine and heartbeat of our nations. And they're abysmally failing to understand that you have to apply real world solutions to real world problems.
So in a few hours' time, we're going to have the FOMC, or the Fed's rate hike decision, which will probably be 75 basis points higher. And there's a lot of talk that the U.S. economy is doing really well. That's why the dollar is strong. They're going to avoid all the energy crisis that we have in Europe. But despite that, we've seen GDP in the first quarter at a negative, also in the second quarter. And I've seen that I think it was the Atlanta Fed GDP now forecast. They just cut it down to 0.3 for the third quarter. So maybe we could look at the Fed and the U.S. economic policy.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a lot of focus. There's all these people going, well, when's the Fed going to pivot? Meaning they're going to end any pretension of QT. They're going to go back to QE. They're going to stop raising interest rates. In fact, they're going to do the reverse and lower interest rates. And it's a great source of debate. They're almost certainly going to raise interest rates, as you say, probably 75 basis points. But the reality is, they don't understand that the reason we have inflation now, or really what's stagflation, because you're absolutely right, the US economy is officially in recession, even though they're in denial about that, but it's been in recession pretty much since 2008, because these metrics used to measure GDP are a complete farce. They have no basis in reality. You only have to look, and I've used this simple example before, where they book the entire cost of an iPhone in terms of US GDP. It's absolute nonsense. They also can keep adding recycled debt as economic growth in their economy. This is just equally nonsense. So in terms of the US economic reality, of course, it's extremely weak. And you also have to come back to the idea that energy is always going to be cheap in the United States. Well, the shale sector is just something of a myth. Yeah, and we're starting to see how the shale sector production's declining. There's not any interest in more investment, not just solely because of the green agenda, just the big financial institutions are not prepared to to stump up hundreds of billions of dollars again for just endless pumping of wells that have a lifespan of maybe 3 years, sometimes less. And also, if the US is such a major oil producer, why is it constantly screaming at OPEC, OPEC Plus, and the rest of the world to produce more oil? I mean, it begged the Venezuelans to do it. It even kind of tried to beg the Iranians by saying, well, you know, we'll agree to the JCPOA if you'll pump more oil. And they said, well, we're not pumping more oil, and especially not for you, so we're not interested. You don't do that if you're a major oil producer, because you don't see the Saudis and the Russians complaining and trying to lower the oil price. In fact, the reaction of the Saudis to the obvious Western manipulation of the price of oil was, because they basically came out and said that in a roundabout way, and then they want more, you know, 100,000 barrels a day production cuts to try and circumvent the paper shenanigans of trying to manipulate the oil price. But the US wants a lower oil price because it doesn't produce oil the way in the quantities it says it does, and the US needs a lower oil price so it doesn't crater its economy. And we're back to this point again. We've known this for years. I mean, you want an example why the US economy is extremely weak? In reality, just go back to the start of the pandemic. They had an aneurysm and they just printed trillions of dollars to bail everything out to stop the economy collapsing, because there is no strength in the economy. Again, it's all a work of fiction. There's all this completely fudged unemployment statistics, and all the data does not indicate in any way, shape, or form any strength in the economy. But again, a strengthening dollar, and it comes back to why the dollar's being manipulated, is to convince the world that you need to hold dollars, that the dollar's still, a safe haven. Look, the US economy is doing fine, and this is why the dollar's strong. It's not why the dollar's strong. It's been blatantly manipulated to try and give that impression of dollar strength when there is no dollar strength, and to try and convince people that de-dollarization, etc., isn't happening, because again, the dollar is everything. It's a matter of national security for the United States. But if you look at the reality of the US economy, it's no different to the West in any way, shape, or form. And just because the dollar's stronger doesn't indicate anything. For me, the Fed, I think, just simply hasn't grasped that you can't raise interest rates to cure the inflationary problems. These are structural problems. And it's not because the economy is overheating. I mean, how could the economy be overheating if it's in recession? And it's just, this is a complete contradiction in terms. So they just simply need to understand, again, you can't print energy, you can't print food, you can't print commodities, and you can't create shortages in markets by placing sanctions on major energy producers. And also, Russia's a major commodities producer. The West depends on fertilizers. If it doesn't get fertilizers, its crop yields go down. If its crop yields go down, the price of food goes up. If the price of food goes up, you've got major inflationary problems, because food is an important part of everybody's life for obvious reasons. It's the same with energy. So there are enormous contradictions in the energy markets in the United States. They promised the earth to Europe, will replace Russia's energy, and they can't do it. The United States doesn't have the capacity to do it. And also, of course, LNG from the US is 2, 3, 4 times more expensive. So Europe's paying inflation for no reason, on the basis of just it might be, from some people's perspective, an honorable thing to do in terms of trying to counter Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it's just cratering our own economies and financial system in the process. And the other thing with the United States with regards to their treasury market, the yield curve, as we just briefly spoke about a few minutes ago. I mean, just look at it. I mean, it's the biggest bond implosion. I'm no expert on bond markets, and I haven't been looking at bond markets for decades, but for me, it's the biggest indication of the fact there is enormous amounts of dumping going on. And they're trying to silo all these treasuries. They're trying to keep them off the Fed balance sheet. They're trying to hide them and squirrel them away somewhere. So the world doesn't realize, but you cannot have the yield curve. I mean, I think that 1 year has gone up something like 75 times higher than it was 12 months ago. The amount of dumping that must be going on. So where's it gone? Where have these treasuries disappeared to? Because they're not all on the Fed balance sheet. So when you have this enormous cratering of the treasury market and how the entire Western financial system hinges on these treasury markets, and why we're in that window again, that if the Fed carries on with, or actually seriously wants QT to happen, and that's highly debatable, I think we'll see a repo crisis pretty quickly. And hence why they did this test. It was the 8th of September, just to test the functionality of a repo market. It was very small nominal amounts. Why would you do that? There's no point unless you actually think there might be a reason to reactivate repo markets as opposed to reverse repo. And we're hearing banks quietly talking about liquidity issues. So in no way, shape or form is the United States immune from inflation. And again, you have to come back to this point. How much is the inflationary data massively manipulated? We know in the West, inflation's at least 10% higher than published data. I mean, in the United States, it could be considerably higher. And then there's all the massaging and fudging data. But the reason the United States is, with its strategic petroleum reserves, I think it's up to 150 million barrels, which is trying to dump into the market to try and lower the oil price, because it's desperately trying to contain the problem of how it's going to damage and impact its own economy. And it's not actually having an appreciable benefit to the US in any way, shape, or form. And subsequently, they're going to need to buy all this back. And who are they going to buy it from? And at what price? I mean, again, just short-sighted thinking, but they are desperate to suppress the price of energy in their own country. And to all intents and purposes, if you were producing all this energy the way they claim, you wouldn't be quite so concerned, because it's not a concern to Russia. Russia doesn't have a problem, because whatever it costs Russia to pump a barrel of oil or produce, a 1,000 cubic meters of gas is what it sells itself in the economy. It doesn't charge itself spot prices. This is why it helps to contain inflation, why China's inflation is a lot lower, like 2.1%, is because they're buying Russian energy dirt cheap. And people are going, oh, this is because there's a really bad relationship between the two nations. No, it's because they've signed 30-year contract to get cheap energy. And Russia still makes a decent profit, and China does very well out of it. And again, it's a signal of strength of relationship, not the idea that the West has it's a very fragile relationship. China is very angry with Russia about the Ukraine war. This is just nonsense. I mean, again, it's just wishful thinking. And the West would do far better to look at realities instead of basing all its thoughts on what it wants to see. And it thinks if it says it, it makes it reality, and it's not reality at all.
So if it wasn't, I mean, as bad as it is, like the West, the US, the UK, the EU shooting themselves in the foot, digging deeper and deeper. We hear this morning, if it wasn't as so bad, it's gotten even worse, in my opinion. I just wanted to know what you think about what's happening vis-a-vis Russia and the Ukraine and the regions where the Russians now or those regions are going to conduct referendums. And if you think that could trigger some kind of bigger war, hopefully not, but what are your views on that?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, this is something that the West doesn't want to either admit or just doesn't think it's reality. Russia is not, okay, I've always called it a war because it's a war. Let's not mince words, but from a Russian perspective, it's not a war because they have not fought with what you call elite forces. They've used relatively little firepower, and they've been very limited in how they've conducted the war. This is a statement of fact. Whether people want to believe in the West, who cares? This is just what's happening. This escalation, first of all, let's deal with where they've gone for this partial mobilization of 300,000 additional reservists. These are people who've actually been in the military for a period of time. They're going to be sent to Ukraine. Why? Because the contact line between Russia and Ukraine is now over 1,000 kilometers long. Russia doesn't have the forces to hold that forever and a day, so they have to put more forces in to bolster, from their perspective, and this is what we're talking about, their perspective, to bolster the defense, and also in the future, if they want to conduct any more offensive moves, which they're still doing in certain areas for sure. The other point with regards to these referenda, this was always baked in the cake, particularly Donbass, Lugansk, and Donetsk. But there's Zaporizhzhia, there's also, of course, Kherson. And they're going to have referendum in these 4 oblasts or regions now. The question is, it doesn't matter whether the West agrees. I understand perfectly why the West says it's illegitimate, although they need to reflect on what happened in Kosovo before they start throwing, stones when you're in glass houses. But anyway, the point is, and it's come out the blue. The announcements happened very suddenly. This is a strategic move as much as anything, because it's almost inevitable, and the West will say these votes are rigged. Well, fine, it doesn't matter whether they're rigged. They probably won't be rigged, but even if you believe it, it doesn't matter. These, regions will become part of the Russian Federation, as it's called. That changes the entire complexity of the war, because it's one thing launching little forays, a few shells into Russia occasionally. If you're starting to try and bombard civilians in Donbass when it's part of Russia, then Russia will turn around and say, right, it's no longer a special military operation. It's now a war. And if it turns into a war, from Kiev's perspective and the Ukrainian people, sadly, this is a major escalation, because they've already given a little hint of bombing infrastructure, which they hadn't done previously intentionally, like dams and power infrastructure, etc. They've kind of shown we can do this, and we shouldn't be antagonizing Russia to do this even more. Okay, I know people are saying that that Ukraine has to defend its borders. Okay, I'm not disagreeing that from a Ukrainian perspective, of course, but we're back to this point. People in the West, and I made this tweet, think Putin's unhinged. Okay, that's fine if you believe that. But you're constantly goading and antagonizing the president you think's unhinged, and the Kremlin, who is a major nuclear power who could unleash devastating nuclear destruction to the Western world. So why would you keep antagonizing someone you think is so unstable? So either your policy decision is ridiculous, or you know in reality he's not insane. It's one of the two, and it doesn't matter what people perceive. They're the two options, because you wouldn't antagonize someone who you think is unhinged by other than being absolutely insane, short-sighted policy decisions, unless you didn't think the person was insane. But the point is, this is an escalation or potential escalation. And also, Russia's made that from their perspective, and we have to take this seriously, that if the West provides any long-range missiles to the Ukrainians, then that's an escalation, that's a red line, and therefore the gloves could be off from Russia's perspective. And they may start using firepower we don't want to see them use, because sadly, the people who suffer will just be the innocent civilians of Ukraine. And some of them could be ethnic Russians, of course, as well as ethnic Ukrainians. And they're the people, in the end of the day, who are suffering the consequences of this. Now, this isn't defending Russia's policies in any way, shape, or form. But the only way this war ends eventually is by some peace negotiation or agreement. And the longer the war drags on, the less Ukraine may have in being able to negotiate an agreement, whatever that might be. And it has to be an agreement that both sides agree to, because this war cannot carry on indefinitely. The biggest miscalculation for me from the West's perspective is they're saying this war is dragging on because Russia's losing, or Russia's bogged down, or Russia's military is useless, or Russia's run out of missiles. It isn't. People should listen more to what Russia says, because they've actually told people what they're going to do. But no one in the West believes it. They've said, we're in no rush to end this war. This war can carry on as long as it needs to carry on. Now, the problem with that is, the longer this war drags on, it has huge effects on us in the West economically, financially. It's dragging us more and more into the abyss. The other thing is, it's also, we're depleting our own missiles and military hardware in the process. And people say, well, the military industrial complex are happy because they can rebuild with new weapons. Well, that's true, but the problem is they don't have the raw materials to do it. Even the Pentagon's admitting it'll take us years to replace the arms that we currently have spent in giving them to the Ukrainians. The other thing is in the process, the Russians have stated, and the West can profusely disagree with this, where they've said, we're going to demilitarize the whole of Ukraine. Well, the longer this war goes on, that might become more realistic. And we're not saying it is, but we need to deal with realities of things. We need to stop believing that the West's winning and Ukraine's winning and it's an abysmal failure for Russia. We need to deal with realities and accept that if we keep provoking Russia, the risk is they'll use far more heavy artillery. They could, I'm not saying they're going to use nuclear weapons, I don't believe it for 1 minute, but they could use more heavy-duty ballistic weapons. They could start to utilize Kinzhal's, etc., in a far greater capacity than they are now. They can do this, and we don't want them to do this. We want a peaceful resolution. And, we're back to this point. If the Minsk agreements had been put in place, we would have never had the war. We'd have never, maybe Donbass would have eventually wanted to become part of Russia. I'm not agreeing that that was the answer. That might have happened, but they wanted autonomy. Would have saved all the problems. Now we have a war. What happens with Kherson and Zaporizhia? I mean, are they ever going to be part of Ukraine again? It's highly unlikely. Now, there's an argument that someone might say, well, Russia might end up losing, but what happens if Russia carries on and takes Nikolaev and Odessa? And if they do, and we're not saying they will or they'll succeed, but if they do, Ukraine's landlocked. It then has lost all access to the Black Sea. This has serious ramifications for Ukraine. A lot of the industry is in the south and east. This will have a devastating effect on the economy. So we have to start to think that sometimes you have to make decisions from the Western perspective that may stick in your throat, but is that a better option and a more viable option? With the question, does this escalate into World War III? No. That's a lot of sensational talk. The cooler heads in the military know that the World War III is not an option because it's mutual assured destruction at best, and maybe some heads in the West in the military go, well, actually, maybe it's not. Maybe we risk suffering more serious problems as a result of that than Russia, because at least some cool heads in the West know Russia's nuclear capability is significantly greater than the West, because a lot of Western technology is from the 50s and 60s. They've got technology that's 5-10 years old. How could the old technology possibly be on par with modern technology? It's not possible. So we need to, again, think about this and just realize that because of what I've said, it's not a question of supporting Russia. I don't support anyone. My role in this, from my perspective, is to assess what's going on, assess what the outcomes and the possibilities are, and what ultimately would be far more beneficial for us in the West. Because what's the point in us fighting a war that's causing enormous amounts of economic, financial, and societal destruction in the West, which it is, and it's continuing to do so? Is Russia actually, I'm not saying Russia wins the war. Does anyone ultimately win this war? And the answer is no. And that's on both sides, because the outcome is not going to be a victory, because you're going to have a Ukraine that's likely broken into pieces. It will be very hard to see how Ukraine ever becomes a whole nation again, because there is going to be all this ideological hatred from ethnic Russians on the one side, and there's going to be extreme hatred on the other side by a proportion of Ukrainians. This is just sadly what happens in the outcome of war. Is this an acceptable solution to the problem? No. But at the end of the day, the war, I think from Russia's perspective, they're happy for the war to drag on and on. I'm not convinced the West can stomach the war dragging on and on, because I think it gets to the point where it politically, and let's just look at it from that perspective in the West, everything is about political survival. So they've managed to justify the war so far by saying, well, look at what Russia's doing. And they've invaded a country, and this is absolutely unacceptable. And yes, from that perspective, you can legitimately argue that point. You can also argue the point that, yes, we need to punish Russia, even though it's not succeeding economically or financially, but this is why we're doing it. So we're going to sanction them. We're going to have energy embargoes. Okay. And in one sense, you can justify that to people. But if the war carries on, and the West suffers more and more economically, financially, people are going to start going, this is not an acceptable price that I'm paying, because I might lose my job. I might lose my home. I may start to suffer that I can't pay my energy bills, or I'm very cold in the winter, or I'm having to cost cut in terms of the food I eat. I'm starting to suffer serious economic hardship. Now, if that grows into a significant proportion of the population, Western politicians are then going to look internally and go, well, I have to survive this crisis internally. So what's more important to my political survival? The domestic problem in my own country, or what's happening, 1,000 miles away in Ukraine? And there can be that flip point where certain Western nations will go, enough's enough. We're not supporting this war anymore. We cannot do this because it's political suicide. It might have been suicide to turn our back on it 3 months ago, but the world's changed. The West is in this cycle of imploding. And we have to then make the necessary decision. Now, part of that is going to be financial. They're already doing that, but is that going to be enough, or do they have to turn internally and realize that whether they like it or not, their political aspirations with respect to Ukraine have to be thrown out the window? That's something that's now figuring in the thought process in the West. Now, if the West at some point eventually abandons Ukraine and says, we can't fight this war with you anymore, we can't keep doing what we're doing, then what happens? And the West is thinking that day will never happen. But if that day happens and you just abandon Ukraine, well, what's the outcome? What does that mean for Ukraine as a nation? And what does that mean from Russia's perspective? And what might Russia do as a result of that? These are the things we're not thinking about. We're just thinking in very binary terms that the war's all about because eventually we'll defeat Russia. And here's the problem with that assessment. Russia's a major nuclear power. From Russia's perspective, the way they're talking, this is a war they're going to have to win, no matter what. Now, I don't mean no matter what in the sense that they'll go to a nuclear war option with the West. I don't mean that. But from their perspective, this is now a war they're fighting against the West. They've come out with it and said that statement again today. So for them, this is a war to defend multipolarity in the future against unipolarity and the death of it. So we should be very careful in assuming that Russia will collapse, that Putin's going to be removed from office, because we said that back in February and it never happened. And we need to better understand Russia's resilience, the resilience of the people, the support of the people. In fact, the irony is many Russians are actually angry that Russia hasn't been aggressive enough in its policy decisions with respect to Ukraine. That was quite a bit of criticism that was going on in the Russian media with Russian people. And the idea they're now partially mobilizing actually will get a lot more support in Russia. And this is, again, another miscalculation in the West. So the bottom line is we all want the war to end. All wars are abhorrent. Anybody dying as a consequence of war is a tragedy. And no less or no more so on whatever side of the fence people choose to sit on. From my side of the fence, which I don't have, it's abhorrent that anybody dies. I don't want to see a single Ukrainian die. I don't want to see Russian forces die. I don't want to see anyone dying, because that's the futility of war. But we are in a war. We are where we are. We need to start thinking in a more adult-like way as to how do we resolve this, rather than believing rhetoric in the media and believing that somehow Russia's going to capitulate as a result of this, because there is no evidence to suggest Russia's going to capitulate. And I know there's this belief about the whole episode in Kharkov, but you notice they were all triumphantly saying how the Ukrainians took several thousand kilometers of land. They didn't put the context in. But they've gone awfully quiet since and not said any more about what's now happening in Kharkov or the Kharkov Oblast. The question that everyone needs to ask: why? Why are they not going on about the ongoing success of that operation? Maybe it's because the operation may have been initially perceived to be successful from a territorial perspective, but what's happening on the ground now? And again, there's all these commentators in the West and also in Russia who are armchair military experts who don't know anything that's actually going on. So there's no point asking them what's going on. And in the fog of war, we don't know, but we can go by some of the cheerleading from the West. If they stop cheerleading, it's generally because something's going on that's doesn't fit with the narrative of cheerleading. It's rather like the Kherson offensive, which turned out to be a disaster for the Ukrainians. They were cheerleading that, then they stopped talking about it and almost pretended it never happened. Now, I'm not saying exactly the same things happened in Kharkov, because we don't know it yet. And that's the point. No one in the West knows, and no one in all these armchair Russian commentators know either. The only people who know what's going on is probably the Russian high command, whoever's in that, Putin, etc. And there might be odd people in the West, in military circles, who have some idea of what's going on. But we need to also factor in that wars aren't won and lost in a day. And just because Russia might appear to suffer a catastrophic defeat, as the West likes to call it, doesn't mean it was, or B, that they're losing the war, and vice versa. Russia can make major gains today or tomorrow. It doesn't mean they're winning the war decisively between one day and the next, or any of this has any significance in the broader context. So these are important points, and I can't stress enough. I'm not interested in Russia winning the war or Ukraine winning the war. I'm concerned about the outcome of it, what the consequences will be for both Ukraine and in a broader context, us in the West, and how that could affect us as people now and for the next 10, 20 years. Who knows what the ramifications will be, and what that means for the future prospects of, in a broader sense, for Europe and the West, and also a recognition of the damage that the sanctions are doing in terms of our reputation in the global South. And we've used Saudi as an example. Saudi Arabia has on numerous occasions in the last few months politely told the Americans to go. We're not interested in talking to you. We're not going to support your energy markets. In fact, we're going to do what suits us, meaning Russia and us. We're trading, working with the Russians and the Chinese, and we don't trust you anymore. You've destroyed the trust, and there needs to be a reflection upon the fact that many people in the West think Russia has no allies. It has 90% of the world's population who will firmly support Russia and their actions, and the West needs to deal with that reality instead of pretending it's not reality.
Paul, thank you very much for coming on and for giving us your point of view, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And unfortunately, from what you're telling me, and it's nothing really too new for me, it looks like this war in the Ukraine, whatever you want to call it, of course, it's bad for the Ukrainians, bad for Russia, but it's also really bad for us in the West. And unfortunately, from what you told me, there doesn't seem to be much hope, except in the political front. Maybe this weekend, that could be the start of it. I think there are general elections in Italy, and the coalition there between, I think, Meloni, Berlusconi, and I forgot the other guy. Maybe that could switch things around, because I've known that Berlusconi has been a pretty good friend of Putin, so maybe there is hope. So before we wrap up, maybe you could tell the viewers where they can find you on social media, and also about your podcasts, which I think are a great value for about a pound. I would say, yeah, it's a pound a week. You can get this kind of analysis that Paul has just given us. I think it's a great value.
Well, thank you. Well, first off, thank you very much for saying. Yeah, we'll start with the podcast. Yeah, we've been doing it for 6 years. I think we're the one that's the last one was 1539 or something like that. So there's a lot of podcasts, and we've been outlining the rise of the multipolar world, the decline of the unipolar world, and we've laid out all the plans in a very broad sense years ago, and they're all playing out now. And because there was always a drive to achieve multipolarity in the world, whether the West likes it or disagrees with it's not the point. And we've made the podcast very affordable. You can go to the SiriusReport.com and you can subscribe. If you subscribe for a year, you get a month free. We keep it very cheap and affordable because we think that it should be something that's accessible to as many people as possible. We've been approached several times to take it private, offered stupid money to do so, and we've said no. We refuse to do that because we think it's something that should be accessible to people. Now, I know there are people who say, well, why is it not free? Well, would anyone work for free? We have bills to pay, and we put a lot of effort in, far more hours than people necessarily realize, and therefore I think we should be paid for what we do on that basis, because, and also it's the accuracy of it, and it's the detail, and we don't repeat ourselves. We are always coming up with new material, things that support existing assessments of things, or new things that we think are very important, that maybe geopolitically, economically, financially is off the radar for most people because no one's particularly discussing it. And so we cover a broad range of everything. So like, for example, we did the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit and broke all that down, discussed it in detail and what the ramifications are. So that's what I need. The website, yes, it needs updating. We need to put more articles, but there's something we're working on in the pipeline, so that will be an interesting development to talk about when it's live. And from a social media perspective, yeah, we're handle on Twitter is at the Sirius Report. We're extremely active on that, practically 7 days a week. And it's sadly an irony that before the Ukraine war started, I think we had 8,000 followers. We've now got 96,000. It took a war for this to happen. It's a kind of really ridiculous irony that we never said anything differently for years, but a lot of people gravitated during the course of the war, and we just tried to be objective. And I know sometimes people think my tweets are anti-West. They're not. I'm critical of the West because I want the West to make the right decisions, or at least try to make the right decisions that benefit us primarily. And that's not just to do with the war, that's in a broad sense. And to actually do something to try and arrest the problem of the rapidly disintegrating unipolar world of which we're part of, and also to not treat every aspect of multipolarity as a threat, and maybe realize that if we integrated into it, it would be advantageous for us. And as much as we ideologically, people may really hate Russia, and I don't agree with that assessment. I think it's very detrimental. But if you believe that, okay, that's your choice. But we also have to realize there are things that we need to cooperate and work with. And that's not agreeing with anything that Russia does or doesn't do or what we perceive to do. It's how we have to change in the future. And we don't have to be best friends with Russia. We don't even have to really be. We have to realize there are things we're going to have to cooperate on. And ironically, there are many things. Privately, the Russians and the Americans are cooperating with each other 24/7. That's how the world operates. but we need to reach a point where we understand that Russia has energy that the West needs, and because the West has only really survived, particularly Europe, with cheap Russian energy. This is, again, a statement of fact, and we need that energy. And we need to find a way to continue having that energy without all the problems we're experiencing now with, and also finding a way to, if we want to wean ourselves off Russian energy, fine, that's a decision. But you can't make a decision during the course of a war when you need to have plans in place that take 3, 4, 5 years. To me, you wean yourself off, you have resilient alternative supplies that are cost effective, that fits in with your economic strategy. We need to have those in place and not take a knee-jerk decision to terminate using Russian energy without realizing what the ramifications would be. And I think these are important points, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get people to engage who might fundamentally and ideologically despise Russia, and maybe China for that matter. And okay, that's your choice, and that's fine. But to understand that the world's a lot more complicated, and if the West wants to thrive in the future, it's going to have to radically change its attitude and behavior, and that's going to involve some degree of compromise, and vice versa. There will have to be compromise from Russia's perspective with the West. It's a two-way street. It's not one way, and that's going to be immensely challenging, but we can't continue with things the way they are, because it is enormously damaging to us in the West, as we're seeing. And in fact, ironically, it's emboldened the West to embrace China and Russia and multipolarity. Even if you profusely disagree with that, okay, that's fair enough. But they're actually played into the hands of Russia as a result of this, and we need to accept these are realities instead of just denying it and saying it's propaganda, when it's self-explanatory that that has happened if we just pay attention to the realities of geopolitics, economics, and finance.
Paul, thank you very much. I wish you a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Thank you.
And yourself.
Thank you very much. Take care.
And thank you too. And you.